Hello, everyone. I thought I would talk to you about the value of reading classic literature. Well, one of the things that you will get out of classic literature is you will get to see the thoughts and opinions of people who lived before you. You will get to see the opinions of people who lived in the 19th century or in the 1920s or 30s or during the Elizabethan period, or if you could even go back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece. Of course, you'll be reading translations at that point. But I think that by reading classic literature, you can get a sense of what society was like then, and because especially classic literature, and this was especially true during the 19th century and early 20th century and mid 20th centuries, is that it would try to portray the consensus or the so-called consensus values of the time. Now, in many cases they weren't really the consensus values, but they were it was the popular consensus, and that you'll get to see what people at that time at least outwardly thought and projected, and you also have to remember that everything was censored and controlled to a certain extent, and therefore everything was filtered through what the powers that be thought would be proper. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. And so, in the 19th century, for example, if you read a Dickens book, you would get to see many of the values that people had at that time. Now, of course, there's no such thing as universal values in any time period, but you will get to see what people thought and how they behaved. And in some cases, you might think that the values of the past are perhaps superior in some cases to the values now, because just because if you always think that the values now that those are always what are proper and right, well then you're being culturally relative. But no, sometimes I'll read. I quite admire how people in the past had, I think, a greater sense of duty, of family, of faith, and I admire that immensely. And now, of course, there are things that I don't admire, because there were also plenty of, especially this is especially true of the 19th century, plenty of intellectual types who valued the more practical aspects of Christianity, but thought that you didn't need the superstition, that you can only have the values. But in many cases, that led to Victorian repression, because you had this society where people thought that they could. Where some people thought, not the average person in the street, but mainly like the intelligentsia, thought that they could keep the value, so to speak, but then do away with the spirituality, which meant that since a lot of these intellectuals, that since they didn't have a relationship with Jesus or Christ or God per se, then it became purely about legalistic rules, because Christianity, of course, is not about legalistic rules. It's about having a relationship and you do what's right because of Christ and all that. But if you take that away, then it just becomes about these arbitrary cultural rules that people might follow for a time, but then they'll wonder, well, why are we following these? There's something transcendent or objective about them. And then so they'll cast them aside. So that's what, if you look at the way the upper classes lived, in the 19th century, you will often find that kind of religious hypocrisy where the faith wasn't very deep or it was superficial. But then among the common person in the 19th century, the average person in the street, you'll find people who were very serious in their faith, and who were very moral and decent people. And so you'll find an abundance of different kinds of values, and in your readings, and and you could also find, and then if you read some of the romantic poetry, for example, you'll find the way that certain radical subcultures thought, like for example with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron believing in free love and all of that. You'll get to see their philosophies, and they were going kind of against the grain of their society. And so, but again, through reading, you'll get to know the thoughts and philosophies of people who are long dead, and because ultimately we can't bring back the dead, but you can commune with people from different time periods through reading, and you can have a kind of almost intellectual exchange with said people through reading. So that's one of the values of reading classic literature, is that you can in some ways revive the past, because the past can ultimately live in your mind and in your imagination.